In certain subcultures of American religion, C.S. Lewis is absolutely beloved. But has he always been that way, or is his reception in America a little bit more complicated than that? Well, that's what Mark Noll's new book, C.S. Lewis in America, is all about. Let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I have here a copy of the new book from Mark Noll and IVP, C.S. Lewis in America. Thank you to IVP for sending this along. Those who are watching this might be interested to know this is part of the Wade lectureship series that's, I think, based in Wheaton. And this is a whole series of lectures that have been put and published into book form on writers like Tolkien, Lewis, Chesterton, George MacDonald, Dorothy Sayers, kind of that group of writers who are all kind of contemporaries of each other. I believe it's the Marion Wade lecture series, and also Wheaton houses a collection of letters and documents from all of those writers. That's specifically why these lectures have kind of come out of that center. So this is part of that series. I've read a handful of books in that series. I'm a big fan of all those writers, so I'm interested in kind of these titles as they come out, and this is the newest entry. So that's just a little bit of the context of the publication of this one, but let me take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research, the readability of it, and then my reaction to it. It's a fairly short book, so I'll keep this hopefully on the shorter end of my reviews. Let's get into it. So the main idea of C.S. Lewis in America, Mark Noll is an historian, a widely regarded, well-regarded historian of American religion and evangelicalism specifically. And so this is an short historical study of the beginnings of C.S. Lewis's reception in America specifically. Now, I'm going to say a little bit more about this in my reaction, but this is kind of dialed into a specific historical interest. And that very specific historical interest is, how did C.S. Lewis's initial reception kind of look in America, in different aspects of American culture? The subtitle talks about the years 1935 to 1947, so that's a very specific 12 years, and notably that's before the publication of the Chronicles of Narnia. Arguably, probably not even arguably, it's probably just a fact at this point, his most well-known work, aside from maybe Mere Christianity. But this is pre-Narnia Lewis, and how his writings were received in America, specifically in kind of that 12 years leading up to and around World War II. So it's a very, very specific historical interest. It's kind of the first thing to say about the main idea. And it's also based on lectures, and there's 3 different lectures that are kind of captured here. One is, and he fragments out the subcultures and how they received Lewis's writings, and those 3 subcultures are, first, how did Roman Catholics in America receive Lewis initially? Secondly, how did kind of the mainstream secular, quote-unquote, media landscape receive him? So like how was he reviewed by mainstream publications who had their eyes on literature? How was he reviewed in those arenas in that decade? And then lastly, how did evangelicals receive him initially? So those are the 3 subcategories of the book, and they're each talked about in separate chapters with responses from other scholars after each chapter on that topic. So that's what the book is about. And so he charts kind of how did each of these subcategories or subcultures receive Lewis, and what were their reactions to these initial writings. Notably, writings like the Screwtape Letters is probably one of the most well-known in that era. Also talks a little bit about the early Space Trilogy writings and stuff. So that's what the book's about. C.S. Lewis in America is about that. Now, the research behind it, I mean, I don't feel like you need to say too much on this, because Mark Noll, if you follow evangelical religious history writing at all, Mark Noll is like a towering figure in that field right now. So he is no slouch at all. He's done a ton of work on the subject and on the history of American religion in general. So the research is extremely good. And it's a lot, even though the book is very short, it's replete with primary writings. And I was particularly impressed with like when he talks in the second section, for example, about how Lewis was received in kind of mainstream media world. He has a lot of primary quotes from publications and periodicals from the late 30s, early 40s talking about Lewis, and it's really, really interesting to read snippets of these original receptions, even from people like Thomas Merton in the chapter on Roman Catholics. Like, it's really fascinating to read these little primary first-person like insights onto how were people reading Lewis before he was such a kind of ubiquitous, well-known name as he is today. Really, really interesting, and he does some deep deep cuts into some primary historical sources, which, again, is not a surprise because Mark Noll is no slouch when it comes to historical work. So that's what's going on in the research there. The readability of it is these books are interesting in their readability because they're lectures, as I mentioned. They're originally captured in lecture form, and so in a way that makes them quite readable. And it's also, the book is very short. And so it generally is a very readable book, especially in the length. One slight wrinkle on this, and this is true of all of these, I think, the Hansen Lectureship, I think is what it's called, from the Marion Wade Center. All of these books in this series include these response sections from scholars, mostly, I think, Wheaton scholars who teach at Wheaton. And I have a frustrated relationship with these reactions just because they break up the flow of the book in some ways. Their responses to each chapter, and sometimes the responses are more or less related directly to what was in the chapter. I find that the readability and quality of those responses just ranges really drastically in all these books that I've read. And so, slight wrinkle. I don't want to overstate that. That doesn't at all derail the project of the book, and the responses do round out the conversation well. They add some more layers and nuance to the topic in what is a very short historical study. So they're there. They do wrinkle the readability slightly in my experience, but in general, I really like the readability of the main chapters and the main lectures that are captured here. So, on to my reaction to this book. Okay, I said at the beginning, this is a very specific historical interest. This is keyed at a very specific kind of type of reader. If you're that reader, this book is awesome. So if you are interested in Lewis, which I am, if you're interested in American religious history, which I am, and if you're very specifically interested in like that era, this is like kind of still post, things like the Scopes Monkey trial, post-fundamentalist modernist kind of split in the early 1920s, but still leading up to World War II, kind of before the Billy Graham era, neo-evangelical movement, like that era. And if you're interested in someone like C.S. Lewis, who has become this like saint, unofficial saint in American evangelicalism, he's become that. How was he received before he became that in this era? If you're interested in that, this is an awesome little historical study. If you don't have all of those, if this doesn't tick all those interests for you, if you want more of a biography of C.S. Lewis, or if you're not interested in how the mainstream secular media received him, for example, this is not going to be your book. But man, if you're interested in that narrow slice, this is an excellent, wonderful, insightful, illuminating, fascinating little study. And so I loved it for those reasons. And specifically, I did want to say, it's very interesting, particularly if you grew up in evangelical America and you grew up on Narnia and you grew up on just like loving C.S. Lewis. It's really fascinating to gain a bit of a more nuanced understanding of how he was originally received, because as Noll argues in these three subsets, evangelicals were actually the most resistant to Lewis for various reasons in these initial phases of his writing. And it's really interesting and historically helpful to wrap your mind around that a little bit more and to gain a little bit more of an appreciation about how Lewis became the figure that he is today. And so this book is, in such a small, readable package, packs a lot of insight and a lot of punch for that very, very narrow, specific historical interest. So if that's you, I've probably talked long enough at this point that you'll know hopefully pretty clearly if this is a book that's for you or a book that you don't necessarily need to pick up based on how interested you are in that very kind of narrow historical parameters. But those are my thoughts on C.S. Lewis in America by Mark Noll. A fantastic, fantastic study given all of those parameters and caveats I just mentioned. So as always, thanks for taking some time to watch.